Looks like my internet's too crappy to actually stream though, so I'm just gonna stop. Alright, so the exchange of bishop for a knight on the queen side, taking back with the pawn to keep the queen staring at the b7 pawn. That is a weakness. Probably plans of taking on d5 later with the c pawn. Maybe some preparations there, I'm not sure how. Possibly maneuvering the knight over or getting the rook behind. And maybe opening up the c file at some point. There is castles for black though, and there's less problems. Plenty of options for black to deal with this threat though. One of them is to completely ignore it though, so you do have b6, but there is c5, which is an interesting move. So b6 is played, just to keep the pawn on the board, followed by knight f3. Not sure what the idea with that move is, except maybe to just develop the pieces to get the bishop out and castle kingside. And the bishop comes back unexpectedly. It almost seems like that was an unnecessary move, especially after castles. Still a pretty even position. Nothing bad has been played by either player. b6 does prepare a nice c5 though, and that might come into play soon. I think that almost knight c6 would be a bad move, because it keeps the pawn from coming. Bishop c6 wouldn't be bad though, because if takes, you can take back with the bishop. But I don't see any obvious tactics out of the opening yet. It's been a pretty close position. That's an interesting sequence of moves there. So c5 was played. But c takes d5, followed by e takes d5. That's the engine recommended line. And followed by c4. So pretty even position. This was a mistake or so for white though, to play c4, but the mistake wasn't taken advantage of. b5 apparently was a good move. I think that there it holds up the white diagonals for white, and would cause some troubles later on. And b5 is still an option for black here. And just the exchange of the c pawn has been played with queen takes instead of bishop takes. Actually a pretty even position, but back to the b5 line here. If b5 was played, it basically forces the queen side to fall apart for white. They don't have a developed bishop, so castling is going to be delayed, but it just provides a very sturdy queenside for black, and I think that's where the advantage comes in, because you basically have two pushed pawns here. Even after this takes, you threaten the queen, and you have a very nice pawn planted on c4. But the queens have been traded off the board. I didn't see how that happened. Oh, with queen d5 followed. With dx c5, queen takes c4, bishop takes c4, and now b5. Alright. Interesting move. This is much better for white though. And white just sticks up a pawn. You're really not going to deal with this pawn anytime soon. So black has a tough position to deal with. White's going to connect their rooks after castles. And they have a very, very solid position, while black's b pawn now is unsupported since the c pawn was lost. And that's an odd move to play, the knight. Yes, and just planting the rook behind the c pawn is totally fine for white. And another interesting move by Dkeey, followed by castles just to shore up the position. Dkeey was thinking a lot in the opening, but he's kind of fallen into just a bunch of moves that just seem nice, but there were a lot of ideas against it for white, and mainly just white had a much better position. Black's queenside is just in shambles here. You can't really leave the rook. Once that rook is attacked with maybe a bishop diagonal, with the rook getting involved, you're basically going to lose the queenside, and you're down to a safe kingside that's completely unguarded by minor pieces. But it seems like taking on the c5 pawn now with the knight, probably the a knight, because the a knight's not really incorporated at all. It gives two strong central knights. So definitely something to be worried about. Overall though, I do prefer white's position. It is very compact and nice, so it takes the opposite way with the e knight taking on c5, and apparently bishop to d6 just wins here for white, which is played. And that's a crucial blunder. There really is nothing. If the a knight were to take c5, d6 would still have been covered, and there wouldn't have been a loss of a minor piece. And yep, down just the whole minor piece after a bunch of exchanges. And it's basically been just getting blitzed out here, but black is worse off. A couple moves that I missed though. So a5 followed by h3, or h4, my bad. Kind of an aggressive move from h4, unnecessary from my point of view. Then rook c2, bishop d5, b4, a4, and before rook a1, a4. Then rook b1 and rook d2, followed by e4 and king f8. And now rook takes on b4. Yeah, I don't know what the deal was with just leaving that b pawn hanging. And it looks like Dkeey's in trouble. Not quite directly mating yet, but really the speed of play is not good from Dkeey. DanielJarlskov can just continue to play fast because they have the upper hand. As long as they don't blunder, they are fine. And after rook takes f7, it really doesn't look like black has much options. Going to lose a second pawn regardless, and there's going to be 4 pawns just coming down on the king side here. And there really is no direct way of stopping them without blunders. Yes, and black has resigned here. So DanielJarlskov has won this game. A completely won game for white that was blitzed out from about the early mid-game on. And honestly, not the best display from Dkeey, considering his clock. I did expect more from Dkeey. And with given ratings, though, I don't blame the result. But I do feel like he could have thought longer in the early mid-game and held on to a quite even position. And really what he did was he just gave up his chances by early on missing b5 to be able to capitalize on the queenside error right here. He would get at least a pawn to c5, c4. And that pawn would be very hard to get rid of. After potentially moving the knight over, getting the bishop behind this pawn somewhat, even bishop to f4 and maneuvering it back, f5 and moving it back to g6 would establish a nice diagonal here for the bishop to later aid the pawn, and putting the rook behind the pawn would help a lot. But following bishop c6 and bishop e2, there was this, which I'll go and check out some of the lines. It's suggested by the computer here. But yeah, bishop c6 was not a very good move. So after pawn to b5, there is takes here, and apparently queen a5 check is the idea. Followed by knight d2. Yeah, that doesn't look too bad. And then, yeah, something like this is very strong. On the queen side, you have 2 very strong pawns, and while it's not directly winning for black, it is very advantageous for black. Causes several threats of promotion later, especially with this looming a pawn. And really, white's position with having to maneuver the knight back after this brilliant queen a5 check, in my opinion. Really, white doesn't have a lot of attacking options now that you've cut off the d3 square from the white bishop. Now that you're pushing back the queen, regardless of where it goes. This bishop kind of, it looks useless. It's just staring at an open diagonal, but there's nothing on it, and there's no plans of putting anything on it. The knight can take back here eventually. It doesn't have to be immediately. You can actually leave this pawn here because the d4 pawn is the threat, not this d5 pawn, because it has 1 support square and the light squares are cut off, so if it ever comes to d7, you'll be able to cut it off. Of course, there is e4 eventually from white, but black had very good chances here. b5 now was a mistake. Apparently knight b d7 was necessary, probably because it will push the bishop back after an exchange of pawns, But even if the pawns aren't exchanged, there's several moves for white here. It's just more advantageous, but computer actually suggests A takes B6, which I don't agree with, but and it suggests a bunch of exchanges, so I don't think that would have been played regardless. But then knight h6, yeah, that was the huge move that was like, I don't understand what you're doing there. I honestly don't understand what the idea here was besides attacking this pawn. But even if you want to attack this pawn, there is a much better move for the knight here, because it can maneuver to the center at some point once supported. Here it really only has 2 squares, and even if it moves back here, and moves here, that's, I guess that's not a terrible idea, but it's not what ended up being played. But that is a lot of moves to get a knight to the center when there is 2 moves, once supported, and while that accomplishes the same idea, knight e4 apparently was the best move here, which, yeah, it's a strong knight, not going to be pushed back until able to do f3, but after castles, white is just better after connecting the rooks, just from a human eye. Sure, there's probably several moves that could be calculated out, and knight d4 hitting the bishop, exchanging just pieces when you have the advantage wouldn't be bad. Apparently castles was not a good move though, later on, here in this position. And yeah, because knight a takes c5, and bishop d6 is no longer an idea because this knight still covers it. And even if it's played, it's just an exchange of pieces, and it's a mostly even position. You just gotta figure out how to deal with your bishop under attack. But yeah, completely fell apart here. Just missing that this wins a piece completely. And if you don't let it win the piece, you just lose the exchange. And you're down quite a bit. So the expected result, though, DanielJarlskov was the much higher rated player. And that concludes my commentary on this game. I hope there are more equal club championship games in the future, but yeah. DanielJarlskov wins the 3rd white victory in the club championship round of 16. There's only been 1 upset so far, so this wasn't expected to be an upset. I think Win Runner, the official Think streamer now, had some ideas of who would win, and it was basically predicted that every player with the white pieces would win. So, that concludes my commentary on this game, with DanielJarlskov with the white pieces winning over Dkeey to advance to the quarterfinals of the Think Club Championship.